at PCI doing Java development. My background's primarily Java development, and I've been with Sonic for about a year and a half. A lot of this presentation I got out of this book, Effective Feature Management. It's free online. You can download it. The caveat is you have to give them your email address, and LaunchDarkly they'll be hitting you up to talk with you. But it's a pretty good book. It's an O'Reilly book. All right, so first we're going to start off with just some definitions. So I won't read this whole thing, but continuous integration. So we're going to talk about CI/CD a little bit. It's the practice of integrating changes from different developers in a team. It's trunk development to get it merged in as early as possible. And the key to doing continuous integration is to have automated testing. So how many people in here are doing continuous integration right now? Okay. So continuous delivery, it's an extension of integration. You can release new changes quickly. So continuous delivery, you do have to click a button though. Anybody doing continuous delivery? Okay. And then continuous deployment, it's basically continuous delivery, but there's no human intervention in the deployment. So as soon as you commit your code, it builds, the test pass, it's off into your environment, deployed out there. Anybody doing that? No? All right. So this is just a little diagram showing the difference between continuous delivery and deployment. And often the auto part there for deployment is what keeps people from doing continuous deployment. Most people stop at continuous delivery. That's kind of what we do at Sonic. We do continuous integration. We do continuous deployment into dev environments, but into production, it's a manual click of a button. All right, so who has to get CAB approval or business approval before deploying to production? Most people here? Okay. So what if you could fully decouple the act of delivering software from the act of releasing? And what if you could deploy anytime you want, but only see the changes, when you're ready for them? So feature flags, they enable this to happen, right? So you can release into production, and your features that you've deployed are actually not released. They're deployed, so you're waiting for those flags to be turned on before the actual features are released. So what is a feature flag? A feature flag is really just a decision point in your code, right? It's basically just a powerful if statement, right? So if the feature flag is enabled, do this, else don't do that. So feature flags, they've been around for a long time. Some of y'all are probably familiar with it. They're in the form of command line arguments. Some people have, undocumented variables in the configuration files. And even back in the day, registry values that were hidden. And so you would flip those values or add the command line argument to turn on some piece of code. So the value of these was typically set early in the life cycle, right? So if you're doing command line arguments, it's at runtime. If you're doing, an undocumented variable in a configuration file, that's at runtime. And then, hidden value in the registry. So there are different points in time that these are actually inputted into your code. It's either at compile, deploy, or runtime. So basically what that means is in order to enable a feature, you would have to, either restart, recompile, or redeploy. So modern feature flagging is different, and it's real time. So when you're doing modern feature flagging, you don't have to recompile, you don't have to redeploy, you don't have to restart. You can just flip the switch on, and the next time someone goes through that code path, it'll pick up that feature flag and execute your new feature. So there's two types of feature flags. They can be temporary or they can be permanent, okay? So temporary ones are the kind that you use for when you're deploying code. So you put your new feature behind a flag, and then that allows you to test the features and then whenever you're ready to release the feature, you flip the flag on. Permanent flags can be used for kill switches or reveal functionality to specific users, right? So say you're a company and you have a free tier and and a couple of paid tiers. You can put those tiers behind the flags and enable them for the customers that are paying for it. And so you want to flag often. It doesn't have to be changes that are only visible to customers. You can flag back-end improvements or infrastructure changes. So say you're switching from Postgres to another database. You can feature flag those connections in your software, and then slowly start rolling out, switching people to your new database. So you have some on the old and some on the new, and then once you're confident in your changes, you can then release the gates and let everybody in. So one important thing is deploy with feature flags. Deploy is not release, right? So when your deployment is decoupled from the release, the feature flags give you the opportunity to create the release strategy, right? So whereas now for most of us, as soon as we deploy, the feature's live. So if we could decouple that, it reduces the risk greatly. So some questions that you can answer that need to be answered when you do this is, how will the feature be released? So are you going to release it to everyone? Are you going to do some rollout strategies to release it to like internal users, beta users? Should anyone see it now? So sometimes you may want nobody to see it until you do some testing yourself and then release it to maybe QA. Who will be getting this feature first, right? So you need a strategy in however you want to release it. So you may want your free customers to test out the feature. That way, if something goes wrong, it's not your paying customers that suffer. Who will beta test it? Will it be rolled out progressively? Do you need to compare it against old behavior? So feature flagging will also allow you to hit the different paths, so you can do testing to see, does the new behavior act like the old behavior, if you need to compare them. And also you need to find out, is there an external date that I need to have it rolled completely out? So it allows you a lot of flexibility. And then what do I do if something doesn't go right? So for the most part, you just flip the flag back off, right? So it's very simple to recover from issues. So teams that are using feature flags are no longer constrained by users seeing new features the moment it hits production, and that's the beauty of it. So you can release into production, nobody sees it until you decide. And also, it gives business, it helps them out a lot because it lowers the risk for them, because primarily for us, we would love to release to production all the time, but a lot of times we're stopped by business, so this helps with that. So one of the funny things, we always have memes about, I don't test my code unless it's in production. So actually with feature flags, this really is no longer a meme. You can actually do that. So with feature flagging, you can test in production, right? So the reason why is, true test environments are difficult to create. Some of the companies I've worked for in the past, they've spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to try to create a test environment, replicate their production environment, only to fail, right? Because there's always some nuances that they forget about, and also you have cost as well, right? So, microservices, anybody here doing microservices? Some? Okay. So they've created new challenges, right? So with microservices, they're a little bit harder to test, right? So, there's volume of messages, transactions, and things like that is really hard to test when you're creating a microservice. So it's really hard to replicate in the lower environments. And at Sonic, we've run into that. Long gone are the days of, realistically testing on your laptop. If you have a monolith, it's a lot easier, right, to just fire it up and start testing locally. Whereas if you have, an API microservice that talks to 3 or 4 other microservices downstream, how do you really do that on your laptop? It introduces some challenges. Real users are unpredictable as well. So there's been several times, right, where we test all these edge cases, we think we've got everything, and then we release it out into the wild. The user does something that we totally unexpected, right? They somehow figured out a way to have some test case that we weren't able to figure out. Your test, and also your test data, right, even at high volume, it'll never replicate your production data. And the closer you come to production level traffic, the more expensive testing becomes, right? So, most of our test environments that we have are just, just a small subset of what we really have in production. So, and a lot of that reason is not because we don't want to, it's because of cost, right? So it's expensive to replicate your production environment. So that's another reason to test in production. So really what I'm saying is kill your test environment, save money, and test in production. So how do you test in production? Well, with the flags, you can use there's lots of different deployment strategies to control your access to your features and instantly turn them off if something goes wrong. And you don't have to roll back or redeploy to turn them off, right? So if you flip the flag on, you start getting some users in there and you notice some issues through monitoring or some of your health checks, you just flip the flag back off and you're back to where you were. No rollback or redeploy needed. So some of the deployment strategies that when you're doing feature flagging, you can do a percentage deployment, and basically you just roll out to a small number of users and increase over time as long as things are healthy, right, and the feedback is positive. This is useful if there's little variation in your targeted user base. So like if everybody's on the same software, you don't have like different tiers of software. That makes it easier to do the percentage deployment. And it can be automated as well, right? So you can start with a certain percentage. If things are going okay, no alarms, then you can automatically increase that and continue monitoring through an automated fashion until your rollout's complete. And then there's what's called a ring deployment. That's a term coined by Microsoft. It's similar to the percentage rollout, except the groups are specifically targeted, right? Whereas percentage rollout, you're just rolling out to anybody and everybody at a certain percentage. That's works for some, but for most of us it doesn't work. So we need to start with some of the lower risk groups, make sure everything's working, and then continue rolling out as long as things are going good. So typically you'll start with internal users. So what I would really like to do is deploy to production and automatically QA is internal QA and any other internal users. So if you're using an email address, anybody with a Sonic email address can access those new features automatically. And then QA can run their test suite in production. And if things go well, then start slowly rolling out to other groups. Facebook does this a lot. They'll start with internal, and then they have what they call canary groups. I don't know if you've been on Facebook before, and all of a sudden you see some new feature, and you ask somebody else that is on Facebook, and you're like, "Hey, have you seen this feature?" They're like, "No." Well, you're part of their canary group that you get picked, and then a day later you log back in, and it's not there any longer. So they'll start with canary groups, and then they go to beta or early adopters, and then basically general release if everything's going well. One thing that's very important when you're trying to do feature flagging is you need to have your baselines for your KPIs and monitoring for those critical areas of your release, right? So you need to know, say if you're in the business of selling things, you need to know, your percentage of sales and how much revenue and things like that are payments still going through, so that when you do a release, you can watch those either manually or in an automated fashion. And if something goes wrong, you can see real quick, and you'll lower your mean time to resolution. So if you don't have those, it lowers your confidence level, and also the business confidence level as well, right? So really, like I mentioned earlier, it's business that's kind of slowing us down. For most of us, we would release, and we're a little riskier than they are. So this would help give them some confidence. So some things for the workflow when you're feature flagging is when you feature flag, you immediately add technical debt, right? So you're putting some logic in there, some if-else for the flag, and that at some point needs to be removed, right? So you've got technical debt. So what most people that successfully do this is whenever you add a feature, you'll automatically create a card as well in your JIRA backlog to go clean up the flag once the feature's been released. And what a lot of people will do as well is they'll automatically, at the time of developing it, they'll create a branch, and basically with the flag removed, and they'll create a pull request, and then they'll merge that request once everything is fine and they no longer need the flag. So if you're going to do feature flagging, you need to early on get in the habit of making sure you have a good workflow. Otherwise, you'll have a code base littered with flags, and that's as time goes on, if those flags stay in there, you have some turnover at the company. People may not even really know what these flags are for. Are they being used? So it's a good idea to get this workflow in. And so the goal of one of the goals of feature flagging is to do trunk development, right? But you don't have to start with trunk development. You can still do branch development and then move towards trunk development. The key is just not have those branches long living, right? Because we all know the merge horror stories that happen when you have a long running branch and then you try to merge it. So you don't have to start with trunk development, but that's your end goal, right? Because with feature flagging, even if you don't have your feature completed, as long as it's not turned on, you can check that code in. It can get deployed to production unfinished, and it's never going to execute. And another tip is don't put your flags in a library. So always keep it into your application level and not some shared library that you're going to be using, because then you've added a dependency to whatever feature flagging technology that you're using. It's dependent. Your library is dependent on that as well, and it could reduce your reusability. And also use naming conventions like for your flags, like FF flag dash whatever. Kind of be consistent. That'll allow you to grep or search for flags whenever you're trying to figure out where all your flags are. And then name your feature flag in your creation and deletion commit messages, right? So if you've added a new flag into your code, when you commit that code, make sure that flag name is in your commit message. And then when you remove it, also make sure that you've added that flag into your message as well. Makes things a lot easier if you have to go back and figure out when the flag was added or removed. So getting started with feature flagging, you can start as simple as using configuration files. A lot of people will start this way. So like if you're using, say, example, Spring Cloud config for your configurations when you start up, you can add your feature flags into your Spring Cloud config, and it will also allow you to annotate your flags so that if the value changes, you can hit an endpoint and those will refresh without having to restart. Then there's also libraries that you can use. Today we'll take a quick look at FF4J, but there's several of them out there. FF4J is specifically for Java. Another one I ran into was Unleash, and it has SDKs for several languages, which is pretty nice because when you're doing feature flagging, if you have a feature that expands through multiple layers of your application, you're going to need to use that flag in all levels, right? So that when you flip that flag, if you have some logic in your web layer or your mobile layer, that needs to be activated as well as on your back end. So it needs to cross-cut across all those different layers. And so that's where having SDKs for multiple languages would be nice. And then there's also feature management services. I mentioned one earlier, Launch Darkly. There's also Split. These are SaaS products that you pay for. There's a lot of advanced features in these, and also you don't have to worry about high availability and things like that. They take care of it. And then they offer SDKs for all the different languages. All right, so let's take a look at this. Okay, much better. So this is FF4J demo that I'm going to do. This came from the creator of FF4J. If you go to YouTube and you search for FF4J, it'll pop up on like one of the first or two videos. It's about a 15-minute presentation. And then he also has a GitHub repo with some samples, and that's where I pulled this from. I slightly modified it a little bit, but basically there's a few applications here. They're Spring Boot apps, so I'll kind of show you those, walk you through those real quick. So when you're creating when you're doing an FF4J, one thing you need is the admin console. So you'll have one project that's your admin console that has the GUI and everything that so you can go to the browser and take a look at all your flags and turn them on and off. They also have a REST API, CLI. There's several ways to do it. So this is just a simple Spring Boot app, and The only thing you have to do to get it running is create this bean right here, and then for your GUI, you just add this bean right here, and then once you run it, FF4J knows what to do. Oh, I forgot to start up something. So for the backend, FF4J, you can use pretty much any backend solution. I just picked MySQL because it was easy. It supports Cassandra, Postgres, Redis, Console. There's several things that it will support. All right, let's see. Okay. So this is what the console looks like. I mentioned earlier, these are all the data sources that you can use to work with FF4J. So what I mentioned earlier about like the services launch darkly and split, you'd have to do on your own with using something like this. So you would need to make sure that your database was highly available, because that's where all your flags are going to be stored. Whatever data store you're going to use, you need to make it highly available because your code will be dependent on it. So all you have to do is come in here to the features and add a flag, and then toggle it on or off. And so before I do that, let's go start up the app that uses a flag. So I'm going to start up this customer order service, and I'll show you it real quick. It is basically also just a Spring Boot app. It uses Timeleaf it's just a little bitty simple UI. But basically the important part here is the configuration is almost exactly the same. You just create a bean that connects to FF4J, and then you don't create the other bean because that's for the UI. And so I'm basically injecting this data source, and in the property files here, it's just the data MySQL data source. So it's being picked up by Spring and creating that data source, and then you're just passing it into FF4J. All right, so the demo app is up, so let's take a look at it. Let's see, I think this is it. Yeah, so it's just a super simple little web page, right? So, and in this web page, I'll show you the code real quick before we add a flag. Let's see, templates. So in here, you can see these if statements, right? So this is where we're pulling in the feature flag Boolean, and in the controller is where we're doing the FF4J test, right? So this is the important piece would be, and so with Timeleaf, I don't know if you know, but you can bind this controller to the web page, and then there's a map that it has. In that map, the actual HTML page can pull stuff out of the map and inject it into the page. So that's kind of what we're doing here. We see this model.put. We're just putting the results of our feature flag check. So it's going to be true or false, right? So we're saying put in the key of feature call us, and then I do this FF4J check for this flag called call us, and it'll return true or false. And then in the HTML code, we just do a simple if, right? So if the feature call us is on, we display a call us button, right? And if we don't have it enabled or created, there will not be that button, right? So as you can see on that page, there is no call us button. So we have our code deployed with our feature in it, but it's not released. So if we want to release that feature, we go into features, and we create a new feature. Let's see, it's called call us, yeah. And so we add that feature, and you can see right here, it's toggled off right now, which so you're gonna have the same behaviors you had with it not being there. So if we toggle it on, if we go refresh this page, so now we have the call us button. So we just released our new feature. Now, obviously, this is a very simple example, but you can kind of see how easy it is to do these things. And so if we had a problem, you know, we just toggle it off. We had some monitoring pop up and say, you know, hey, there's some performance issues. And now it's off. So now it's taking the other path. So it's very convenient. And so with FF4J, there's also some monitoring that you can do. So it's not super exciting here, but you can see, so if you had a bunch of flags that were being used, you can see if your flags are being used and which flags are not being used very much. So it can kind of help you make some decisions on, is it time to get rid of these flags? There's also a time series. It pretty much shows the same thing. And then an important piece is the audit trail. So it'll tell you when flags are created, when they're toggled on and off, so that there's a little bit of an audit trail to see who's doing what. Let's see. Let's go back to the code. Another neat feature is in FF4J is there's properties that you can set. So you can see right here there's this if statement for if there's a phone number, we'll display a phone number. So right now there is no property called phone number. So our page is not rendering a phone number. So if we went back and added a property called phone number, it's going to be a string. So put time and temp in there, where it used to be that. So we have our property there. And so now if we went back to the page, will it show? No, it won't, because the feature is not toggled on. So let's toggle that back on. And so now when we toggle it back on, we have that property that it displays as well. So it allows you to kind of create some different, so if you have information that kind of changes regularly or semi-regularly, you can add it as a property and toggle it on and off. Another neat feature with FF4J, and I'm sure others do this as well, you can create a toggle group. So say you have several different toggles that need to be toggled on at the same time, or say you want to toggle, say you've been working on a 2-week sprint, your feature complete for that sprint, and you want that whole sprint to turn on at the same time, you can group all those toggles together and then turn them on and off at the same time. And so like I mentioned earlier, there's several different data stores that you can use. You can also use different, so your feature and property stores can be, say for example, console has a key value store. You could use console for that. And then for your event repository, you know, you need something that scales better because there's going to be a lot of events coming in. So you could use Cassandra. It also has a cache layer. So if you don't want to be constantly hitting your database, it can cache values so that it will try to get the value out of the cache first. So that will help you scale as well. And any questions?
Can you also set a feature flag that will be toggled at a future time? So let's say that we're planning a launch next week as a team, and we know that on Tuesday, first thing in the morning, we're going to turn this off. I'll make just one of those manually. Does this have any mechanism to say, you know, toggle it to true at this time next Tuesday?
Right, so the question was, can you set like a time in the future for when you want your toggle to go on? And the answer is yes. So one thing I failed to talk about with FF4J is there are several, I think that's it. No. Oh. That's why when you get old, you can't see behind my glasses.
I think that's something you could also do with your CI/CD pipelines, as far as hooking the CLI or the API to, hey, run this pipeline and take that stuff.
Yeah, so there's several ways to do it, but FF4J does have several different deployment strategies. Let's go right here.
Like, you know, I mean, I think the only like if you have that feature that turns on, like that really has to be on it.
Yeah, so you can do strategy-based toggling, role-based toggling. You can, let's see, there was another page I saw that talked about the other, let's see, I can't remember what page that was, but they do what you mentioned, Andreas. They do. Yeah, so you can flip your flip strategies. You can blacklist, whitelist, office hours, release date, which I believe is what you're talking about. So you could even say we want this toggle active while we have support staff in the office, and then at night toggle back off. So there's several different strategies to flip these on and off. Any other questions?
Like, what's been your experience, like, writing code to work with the feature flags? Like, is it usually best implemented as, like, if statements?
Mhm.
Or do you use, like, is it better to, like, have, like, a spring bean that you inject and maybe use a profile term, toggling them on and off?
Mhm.
Like,
So
what's the cleanest way to maintain, you know, while they're active?
right now we're just the only stuff I've done is with this. Oh, yeah. Are there any other ways to do feature flagging without just a if-else statement? So like a spring bean or something like that. And the answer is yes, you can. Let me go to that other page again. So right here, they talk about AOP-driven toggling. So you can, I think from what I read, you can annotate at the interface level and toggle based that way. I haven't done it, but there are other ways besides the if-else.
So that would kind of pick your implementation based on what feature flag?
Yeah. And so you could have a new implementation, and then, like you mentioned, you would annotate and say, when this is on, use this implementation of this interface, and otherwise use the older implementation, which I think is cleaner, right? Because then you can just go take out your old implementation if you want to, or I mean, I guess if you wanted to leave it, you could, but it's best to get rid of it once you decide you're done with it, and then you don't have to go back into code that's actively being hit. You know, you could just it's a lot cleaner. Good question.
Let's say you have a feature that creates bad data in your database. How would you recover from that sort of situation?
So how would you recover if you had a feature that put bad data into your database? You'd have to go clean it up, or roll back your database, or you could, if you feature flagged, you could feature flag to if you could, a different database, and then go check the data. That could be a way you could toggle to a different database in production, and only hit that path for internal users or yourself, then go verify, and then you'd have to have another additional flag after that. But that's one way that you could you test your code. But hopefully by the time you're ready to deploy, you don't have those issues. But data is always a tough one, right? So, and you can always you can, before you get to production, if you still have test environments, which most people will, right? Most people aren't going to really get rid of their test environments completely and go straight to production. You should, you'll have an environment where it gets deployed to automatically, and hopefully you've got some automated tests around that would test any scenario that in the data that you fear that you might hit. So otherwise, have good backups. I haven't experienced that, but with the bad data, but I know it can happen.
Curious what kind of thought process you go through when you get a new feature and you're deciding, should I flag this or should I not?
So if you read online, it's always flag it. So yeah, you can't. It's not bad to overflag. So you should flag as much as you can, as long as you manage them. But you got to keep in mind too, once you start adding flags, you've added technical debt, right? So you have to be disciplined in going back and removing those flags once your code is ready.
Do you actually follow that, or do you find it comes?
So I'm not really doing so at Sonic right now. I'm not we have teams that are feature flagging, so I'm not doing a lot of feature flagging myself. So I haven't really established that as but we're trying to move towards more aggressive flagging, and so that's why this has been brought up, and we've been talking about it, is trying to figure out a good way to do this without messing things up and having a bunch of code that has a bunch of if-else statements in it.
I have a follow-up on that one. So let's say as a team you adopt feature flagging, is there a way to group the flags or maybe by naming convention or groups or some picture here where you could see these are all the flags that apply to these services or service is portion of my code base. So, as you start accumulating hundreds, thousands of feature flags, it becomes very tricky to figure out what these flags are actually for, where it's being used.
Yeah, so the question is, if you have a bunch of flags, how do you figure out where all the flags are? I don't know, personally, I don't know a good way to do that other than keeping track as you're adding them. Also, if you're, to me, it kind of smells a little bit if you have hundreds of flags in your code base all at the same time. So you either got a really young product that you're adding stuff to it at a really rapid pace, or you're probably not cleaning up these flags as you're supposed to. Just my guess. So the flags that we're doing currently at the place I work at Sonic, we're not doing a ton of flags all at once, and also we have domain-specific APIs. So each API is fairly small. So it's not like a huge monolith where we may have 100, 200 classes. So it's fairly easy to keep track of the flags. Anybody else? So what?
Like say you put a feature flag in, but as soon as you enable that feature, it adds a field.
Oh, okay. Migration.
You can't undo it without all that underneath. So you would probably want it to be highly available where it could use either one. If you couldn't do that, you don't get a choice.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you, say you have a feature that adds a field to a database, how do you roll that back? So our strategy, we use Flyway, and so our strategy, and so the migrations, and so once you deploy, if there's a new migration, it'll run it, and you've added whatever to the database. Our philosophy is you don't roll back. If you add a field to a database, and then down the road it's not going to be used anymore, it's just there. So it prevents any issues from pulling a field out from underneath something that needs it. So we don't roll back schemas for the most part. So by the time we get to production, we're fairly confident that we want those fields. So there's no rollback field wise. We go forward. But also, too, we have fairly small databases because they're domain APIs, so each API has its own database. So each database that we have is probably 3 or 4 tables at the most. So it's not like some of the other applications I've worked on in the past that has hundreds of tables, and so that's a little trickier then, right? So. Anything else? All right. Thank you.